Goldberg. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. Tonight's program comes to us through a partnership with the Shalom Hartman Institute, an applied think tank focused on the future of Jewish community in North America. And so we're very grateful to the Shalom Hartman Institute for this opportunity to host Dahlia Lithwick at Berkeley Law. A few words about the Helen Diller Institute. We are housed within Berkeley Law. We host a robust visiting faculty and scholars program. We sponsor courses across campus, 19 of them this year. And we coordinate public, academic, and student programs. Tonight's program sits at the nexus of our home in Berkeley Law and our program on Jewish law, thought, and identity. And I'm very happy to turn to Erwin Chemerinsky, Dean of Berkeley Law, and the Jesse H. Chopra Distinguished Professor of Law, to do the formal honors of welcoming everyone and introducing our speakers tonight. So thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you so much for coming and welcome. As I had a discussion the other day with somebody, if we could have a superpower, what would it be? And the one that I would choose would be only in two places at one time. Because I was supposed to be at another event that started at 5 o'clock, but I said it was so special for me to be able to be here, in part because the Helen Diller Institute is such an integral part of the law school, and I will do everything I can to support it in its programs, but also it's an opportunity to introduce to you somebody who's a dear friend and also one of my heroes, Dahlia Lithwick. Just a little bit. It's true. We've known each other a long time. We've done many programs together. When I say she's one of my heroes, I don't have very many heroes, but I know you don't need many if you choose wisely. Dahlia, just a little bit of background, went to Yale for college, Stanford for law school. Forgive her for going to the wrong law school in the Bay Area. She practiced law, and then she became a journalist, especially covering the Supreme Court. She's been at Slate since 1999 and regularly writes for it, writes for Newsweek. She's written for every major newspaper. She's won so many awards. I was excited to see that she won a Q Award from the American Constitution Society, won awards for her journalism podcast. She's the host of the renowned podcast Amicus. And I don't think there is anyone who writes about the Supreme Court who writes better. I don't think there's anyone who writes with more passion about the Supreme Court. I don't think there's anyone who writes or talks about the Supreme Court with more insight than Dahlia. And she's here to talk about her magnificent new book, and I can say that I read it, so I said it with authority, and I can say if you haven't read it, you should buy it and read it. And we're incredibly fortunate tonight to have her be interviewed by Masua Sagiv. And she is here at Berkeley. I think this is your second year. We've been fortunate to have you. She's a Koret visiting scholar. She comes to us. She got her doctorate in law from Tel Aviv University. She ran an important center at Bar-Ilan University. She focuses very much at the intersection of Judaism and law. And I've been so tremendously impressed by her in the time that we've had her at Berkeley. And so you really couldn't have a better person to have a conversation with Dahlia about it. So again, thank you all for coming and welcome. And thanks to both of you for doing this conversation for us.
Hi everyone, good evening. We're very happy to have you here today. And I'm so thrilled to have this conversation with you, Dahlia, about this wonderful book, Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. The book Lady Justice is a book about women. It's a book about women and power in so many ways, in politics, in law, as individuals, in groups. It is a book about women's stories. Each story, each woman a hero of her own story and also a hero of ours. But it is also a book about our time, the time we are living in, and the institutions that shape our future. It's a book about the pursuit for justice. And I couldn't be happier to have this conversation. I want to start this conversation with something that is seemingly absent from the book, but is actually in the background, and it is very relevant in our politics today. And that's the role of religion in the public square. So, and specifically around law and the Supreme Court. So we just had the 50-year anniversary for Roe v. Wade, and we hear a lot of discussions about some states that are talking about limiting contraceptions. When reading some of the court rulings from last term, Dobbs, the football coach, the guns, for me, maybe as an outsider, it felt as if these rulings were very influenced by religion, or specifically, I should say, were very influenced by Christianity. And it is fascinating to see how in court nomination hearings, where future justices are asked, they are asked about everything. They are asked about race, about politics, about gender, but they are not asked about religion, which is something extraordinary. And I want to ask you for our first question, and I know it's not lightweight, but what do you think that we lose by not talking about religion as we interpret legal proceedings? I didn't see any commentaries about last term talking about religion or where religion was at these rulings. What's at stake for religious populations and communities in the United States with not talking about religion?
So first of all, thank you to Dean Chemerinsky. That was basically the speech they gave at my bat mitzvah. Like, nobody has ever been as kind to me as Dean Chemerinsky. But thank you to Rebecca. Thank you to the folks at Hartman. And of course, my partner here, Masua. And I should disclose, because Masua didn't, that we know each other from before. And we've worked together for some time at Hartman, sort of trying to probe some of the issues. And so when she comes out swinging with the hardest question that I've been asked on this book tour, and it's the first question, it leads me slightly to wonder where this is going to go from here. But you know, I think that it is, in fact, the most salient political question that never gets asked, and that faith and the Constitution and the relationship between them is both everywhere and nowhere in the current Supreme Court discourse. And it's an incredibly freighted question, because if you think about, and I always say to people, when you think about why, for instance, when Amy Coney Barrett was being questioned about her connections between how she thought about faith and her jurisprudence, you may recall that when she was being elevated to the Seventh Circuit, that was the appeals court, so before the confirmations hearings to the US Supreme Court, you may recall that she had actually written about what a religious judge should do if they are Catholic and they don't feel that they can, in congruence and conformity with Catholic dogma, they can impose the death penalty. In other words, she had put this into evidence in some sense. She wanted to talk about it. And poor Dianne Feinstein, in an attempt to probe this question, which seemed reasonable because of then Professor Barrett's writings, asked, you may recall somewhat awkwardly and artlessly, the dogma lives loudly within you, is what she said, which sounded, I said this morning, like Yoda. Like it was not a useful construction of the problem. But you may recall also that in response, professors who think about law and religion from the left and the right said that that was completely unacceptable line of questioning, that the Constitution precludes religious tests for higher office, and that nobody should suggest for a minute dual loyalties, right? That somebody, simply because they came up in a very, very complicated church, let's stipulate that the church that she comes up has lots of things that we could talk about, including the treatment of women. But even if you set all that aside, it's useful to remember, and this is why it's hard, that when Justice Brandeis was being vetted for the US Supreme Court, the level of anti-Semitism directed at him in his confirmation process was appalling. And questions about dual loyalty, right? Are you going to be good for the Jews or good for America? Were everywhere. And so we have to be a little careful when we say, why weren't these issues surfaced out loud at her confirmation hearing? Why were people so hard on Senator Feinstein for trying to talk about this? I think we have to remember what it was like for Cardozo and Frankfurter and Brandeis, whose confirmation hearings were a really ugly celebration of claims about dual loyalty. So that's the first answer, that I think there is a consensus that if you start saying to people, are you going to judge from a place of faith or from a place of doctrine, it never ends well. And I guess I would just parenthetically note, it really doesn't end well for the Jews. And if you also recall when John F. Kennedy was being questioned about his legitimacy, and we had this with Justice Brennan, who was also questioned about whether his Catholicism would somehow inflect on his jurisprudence, you got these kind of fanciful promises, I'll be a Catholic at home, right, and an atheist out in the world, which is not a satisfying answer to anyone. So I think that's a little bit the answer to your question of why there's so much hush around this, and why it is that this is kind of everywhere in the ether. And yet, it took, I think, until Linda Greenhouse wrote the sentence this December in The Atlantic, you had an opinion in Dobbs in which all 6 justices in the majority were born and raised in the Catholic Church. And to fail to say that is malpractice in journalism. And so I think that you are identifying this seam that very much shoots through. And it's not just last year. I mean, Masua is talking about the football coach on the 50-yard line and talking about the Maine school financing case, both from last year and Dobbs. But even this year, right, we have 303 Creative, we have the web designer who, based on religious freedom claims, doesn't want to design a website for same-sex couples. We have religion that laces through the Indian Child Welfare Act case, right, where we have a couple that says that their faith demands that they foster and adopt children, and that the Indian Child Welfare Act that gives priority to the tribes rather than them is discriminating. So it's everywhere and it's nowhere. And I think that the really hard question you're asking that I'm still struggling with, and I know we're struggling with at Hartman, is how do you navigate that without sort of falling off the cliff into bias, into essentialism, into claims of dual loyalty, which is anathema to the way we think about religion in this country. But also, how do we navigate it without being blind and blinkered to the ways that if you can't read the Dobbs opinion and see that claims about personhood and claims about conception and when birth begins, they're everywhere there. And so I think this is, in fact, the hardest question for those of us who cover the court of our lifetimes, because we all know we're doing it wrong, but we haven't quite figured out how to do it right.
And also the different implications that this question has on the different communities and the different religious communities that live right now in the United States. So one of the law professors here, Professor Russell Robinson, wrote a paper saying what model of Christianity is adopted by the court, which is something, again, that you usually don't see. But this takes me to a slightly different direction. When one of the chapters in the book is the story of Roberta Kaplan, the attorney that the New York attorney that filed the suit against the neo-Nazis and white supremacists in Charlottesville. And in this chapter about Charlottesville, you write how your son told you that if we engage with the Nazis, we would lose, and if we ignore them, we would also lose. What are your lessons from Charlottesville?
You know how they say never do television with children or dogs? You should also never do an interview with somebody who knows you as well as Masuha knows me, because she's really quite literally picking on all my emotional scabs in this book. And in case folks don't know, I lived in Charlottesville. I was there in 2017 when the Nazis and the white supremacists marched with flaming torches saying, you know, blood and soil, and saying Jews will not replace us, and terrorizing the African American neighborhoods for weeks with their cars. And as you know, that ended in August of 2017 with Heather Heyer being run over by Alex Fields in his car, and a whole bunch of people injured, like catastrophic, life-altering injury. And when it became quite clear that the Jeff Sessions Justice Department was not going to investigate Charlottesville as a hate crime, because indeed then President Trump had announced that there were very fine people on both sides of the Charlottesville, what I would call invasion or riot. Robbie Kaplan, who was a kind of white shoe attorney at her own fancy firm in Washington, essentially said, if the Justice Department isn't going to investigate and prosecute this as a hate crime, then I will. And she came down to Charlottesville quite literally within 3 days, had assembled plaintiffs, had found expert witnesses, and put on a trial under the federal KKK Act and the state analog to the KKK Act, essentially bringing the leaders of the Nazi white supremacist and other nationalist groups to justice. And you may recall, although that took years and years and years to come to trial, just around this time last year, they prevailed in this civil suit in Charlottesville and won millions and millions of dollars in judgments for the plaintiffs who were injured there. So, you know, Masua's question is a really intriguing one, because when I was living in Charlottesville, we were thinking about this sort of kind of clearly impending disaster through the lens of Skokie, right? The Nazis who marched in Skokie, Illinois, who deliberately targeted Skokie because huge numbers of Holocaust survivors were living there. And that was, whether the high water or low water mark of sort of free speech advocacy, you may recall that the ACLU defended the Nazis in Skokie, right? They said, even if these people are going to come in their uniforms and march through the town and absolutely trigger and traumatize survivors, we have to let that happen because speech is speech, right? And so by the time it became manifest in Charlottesville that this was not merely a First Amendment problem, because the people who were coming were bringing body armor, right, and sharpened poles, and they were in their chats online talking fancifully about running people over with cars. So it was clear this was not just a speech case, but it was something else that looked like incitement, and that the law hadn't caught up. And it was something else under the Second Amendment that it should have been analyzed under, because there was going to be guns there. But the judge who analyzed this case in Charlottesville did it as a straight up First Amendment Skokie type problem, allowed the Nazis and the Klansmen to march in Charlottesville, and everything that ensued. I want to say one other thing about it, just because it was interesting. When we lived there, when this was happening, people would say to us, "Is that your synagogue?" And unerringly, those were people who lived in towns that had 50 synagogues. In Charlottesville, there was one. There was a Hillel, there was a Chabad, but there was one synagogue, and I'm just going to say it because my sons aren't here. They were both circumcised there. They were bar mitzvahed there. Like, this is it. This is the only game in town. And that summer of 2017, as we had first waves of Klansmen coming, then we had the Proud Boys come, then we had ones that it was really like a line to get to town, ostensibly to defend these Confederate monuments, but in fact to continue to threaten and terrorize the Black and Jewish communities. The response within the synagogue was really interesting and really generationally interesting. The rabbi who was our emeritus rabbi, who was probably 70, very much of the Skokie viewpoint, said that the thing we should all do in the synagogue is hide in our basements and close the doors and ignore them, right? Pay them no attention. If you give them oxygen, they win, which is very much, I think, the approach, the American sort of 1970s view of how you deal with attention seekers worked. The rabbi who was, in his 60s, who was then the senior rabbi, very much a product, and I say this with great love, of Woodstock, and the idea that we'll have an alternate event, and we'll open up a venue, and we'll sing Pete Seeger, and the cameras will look at us, and they won't look at the Nazis, and that's how you deal with it, right? You just redirect attention to something beautiful and hopeful. And the very young rabbi, who was 2 years out of rabbinical school, who did not sign up for Nazi invasions of the town, said, you know what, I'm going to go stand in the park, and I'm going to lock arms with the Baptists and the black churches and the other sort of racial resistance movement, and I am going to protect our town. And so quite literally, after Saturday morning services, you would see families sort based on which of those three kind of generations of how you resist Nazis in your town most aligned with your worldview. And it was really funny. You would really see families where the mom was going to the Woodstock thing and the dad was going to the basement to shut the door, and the teenage son was going out to the streets to fight. So I think when my son was trying to capture, because that was all happening, and my son was, I think, 13 at the time, it felt to him those are all different ways to lose. None of those are good choices. And I will say too, because I don't know how much press this got, we had a Holocaust scroll in our synagogue that had to be smuggled out in the dark of night to put in a congregant's home because we couldn't keep the synagogue safe. And we didn't have the police and federal and state protection that we needed. And it was really one of the most terrifying things I'd ever seen in my life. But I do think that question that my son raised, and I quoted in the book, and he's very grumpy because he said, you quoted me in one place and I said this nihilist, awful thing about no matter what happens, you lose. But I do think that became for me the template by which I looked at the last 6 years, is you pay attention to this stuff and you lose. But if you ignore it, you also lose. I mean, that can be said of Marjorie Taylor Greene, and that can be said of the January 6th insurrectionists. And I think it's a comment both on how to think about existential threats, but also on how to think about how we in the media are trying to both be honest and mindful and cover that which is happening that is scary, and at the same time we're feeding it and giving it oxygen at our own peril.
In a sense, so I don't want to say it's almost easy, but it's almost easy to write each story. It was extremely uneasy. I know, not easy. But to write the individual stories. But what you just said made me think about how hard it is today for us, for different minorities, for different people who are fighting injustice to come together and to form coalitions. And I was wondering whether you would want to talk about that, to say something about why after Charlottesville, I was sure that this would be the moment for the Jewish community and the Black community to join forces, and from then we only see more and more challenges in coming together. And you also said it about other. You gave some other examples. It's really hard for us to come together. Would the women in your book be able to come together and join forces?
So undergirding Masua's question, there's a piece that we worked on really for the last year that we worked on together that's going to come out this spring, in which we thought a lot about this question of, and we both noticed this as we were doing sort of Zoom events talking about Charlottesville, that if you said in the Zoom, and then the Nazis came in, somebody in the chat would say they were white supremacists. If you said in the Zoom and then the white supremacists came in, someone in the chat would unfailingly say they were Nazis. And this idea that we had to kind of corner who they hated more and who was the real target here, became a very, very pervasive theme, not just of conversation in Charlottesville about how this had happened and why, but it became a really pervasive theme throughout the trial. And while I was covering the trial, one of the things that was really fascinating to me was that Robbie Kaplan and Karen Dunn were trying to simultaneously tell the story of an attack on the Jewish community, which was chilling and frightening, and an attack on an extremely vulnerable Black community that was as chilling and frightening, and that if the Nazis and white supremacists and Richard Spencer and Chris Cantwell can manage to hate us both, why can't we manage to just be together on this rather than sort of trying to figure out who the real victim was? And it was very, very interesting in the trial. I thought one of the most interesting moments in the trial was that one of the expert witnesses was Deborah Lipstadt, and who has done all this work on Holocaust denialism and has prevailed in trials against people who deny the existence of the Holocaust. And one of the things that Professor Lipstadt did so deftly in her testimony was try to lash together this idea of why it is that all of these groups are aligned in hating the Black community and the Jewish community in the same ways, and what it all signifies in terms of the Great Replacement theory, right? The way she put it pretty starkly was, the puppet masters, the illusion of the puppet masters, and the illusion of the puppets, and that you have to see that connection because it is profoundly connected for them and for what they were trying to do. And it was very, very interesting for the jury, who didn't know that sort of the scope, sort of how wide the aperture is on the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant theory and anti-Black theory, that they're actually really bundled up together, and that it was very essential for the purposes of the trial to tell those two stories. I will say it was fascinating to watch Judge Norman Moon, who oversaw the trial and who was, very old school Southern judge. Like, imagine the judge from My Cousin Vinny. He was that guy. He was like, y'all gotta stop doing. And it was crazy because this guy was trying to understand this complicated thing that he was not an expert on. And it was very, very interesting in the trial to see how sort of reflexively quickly he understood the anti-Black sentiment, but the anti-Semitism was really a stretch for him. Robbie kept noting that he, if the N-word was deployed, because a lot of the Nazis and white supremacists joyfully defended themselves and said all sorts of unspeakable things except they spoke them, Judge Moon would cut off a lot of the anti-Black, awful vitriol very quickly. He didn't even recognize, some of the anti-Semitism and didn't cut it off. So there was a kind of a disparity between his own sensitivity. But it was really, for me, and I think you can talk more about it because we've thought about this so much, almost an opportunity, if we could have done it, to sort of recreate the Dr. King, Rabbi Heschel, that complete, at least, effort to try to align values and interests. And it felt to me that this trial really zigged and zagged between being a trial about anti-Semitism and being a trial about anti-Black, anti-immigrant racism. And in a perfect world, I would have loved to reimagine this trial as something that was able, as you said, to bring together these two stories because they're so clearly bundled together. But I'm not sure that happened. I don't know if you want to add.
I think that the one of the biggest tragedies here is that I think that it proved the fact that the discourse, our public discourse, is completely controlled by the haters. Because what happened is that you had it almost felt like when Professor Lipstadt tried to talk about the puppets and the puppeteers, if you believe the theory of puppets and puppeteers, you will resent the puppeteers. The whole idea of the trial was to say, or a lot of the attempts to fight against anti-Semitism was to say, don't buy into this theory. we are together, we are in the same place. If you buy into this theory, then the Jews are not your partners. The Jewish community is not your partner. It's one more oppressor. And I think that that's maybe one of the tragedies of this trial.
I think that's true, although I think we also have to be very clear, and this is why, again, the narrative of the trial was so confounded by how complex the situation in Charlottesville was, because the trial was sort of held out as a trial about, Civil War monuments, right? These were Confederate statutes that were supposed to celebrate, the great victories in the Civil War, except, of course, come to find out, those monuments were put up in the 1920s, right? They were not put up after the Civil War, and they were put up with one ambition only, which is to flatten and raise Vinegar Hill, which was a black neighborhood that had flourished and thrived in the 1920s, that had bookstores and theaters and had absolutely proven the thing that the white supremacists in Charlottesville at the time couldn't tolerate, which is look at this thriving neighborhood. When the neighborhood was cleared out and the parks were cleared out and the monuments, so-called monuments to the Civil War were put up, a lot of the people who moved into that neighborhood, who put up flourishing businesses and bookstores and theaters, were Jewish merchants. And so it's very, very necessary to tell this story in all of its infinite complexity as a story of how you can, both succeed and also succeed on the backs of other minorities. And as I said, this is not an easy story to think through. It is certainly not the story that was told both about the invasion of Charlottesville and the trial. But to my mind, if you can't peel the onion and look deeply and engage with all those layers, then the trial actually doesn't get you to where you need to go.
In a sense, again, like the first discussion that we had, it's the same sensitivity that we have today. We cannot talk about nuanced conversation. We cannot talk about the things for fear that we'll just hear the extreme versions of the story and the most reduced version of the story. Maybe to something a bit easier now. There are many parts in the book that made me think about strategies for social change, about theories for social change. So, and specifically the role of law in promoting social change. I'm going to give two examples here. Okay, so in the introduction, you write that without access to power, money, and brutality, law has been the best force to promote fairness and equality and dignity for women. So women don't have power. They didn't have classically the power, the money, and the brutality, but they can use law. And it's the most conventional way with which to effect radical change. That's one. And then right in the next chapter, the first chapter that tells the story of Sally Yates. And until the time that she was from the DOJ, and until the time that she resigned, you write that resignation would have protected her personal integrity. She did the right thing, right? But she believed she had an obligation to protect the integrity of the DOJ, of the Department of Justice. So can you reflect on both of your heroes' theory of change and if you will, your own as well? So is it within or outside of the institution or the system, attitudes toward politics, law, evolution, revolution?
So my dear, that is not in fact an easier question, but it is, I think, a through line in the book that I wanted to tell the story of women having a very special relationship with the law, not just with women's voices and the Women's March and women calling Congress to preserve the Affordable Care Act. That's important. But I wanted to say, and now we really see this manifest on the streets of Iran, that there's a deep difference between women who have to put their bodies on the street with no hope of overturning male clerics and women who have the ability, which we still have in this country, to take a yellow pad and take a blue book and go file a lawsuit. And that the machinery of the law is really consequential. That when we think we've tilted straight into Handmaid's Tale in this country, it's actually not true. Because as long as we have lawyers and judges and members of Congress and senators and Supreme Court justices, women have access to power in a way that's very, very different from what we're seeing in countries where women can't even, go to college right now. So that was the first sort of hypothesis. But I think that threaded through that, there is this deep anxiety about legal institutions, right? Because one of the things, and you've just pointed it out, is that in this country, for all but a very few years and a handful of good cases, the institution of the law was a machine of oppression and violence toward women and toward minorities and toward people of color and LGBTQ Americans, and every single vulnerable population that you could name was not benefiting from legal institutions. In fact, that was what was shutting them out of power. And so this question of what do you do when the architecture of the legal system is simultaneously what I sort of call, and here's where I cite Homer Simpson, the constitutional philosopher of my preference. Homer Simpson says of beer, it's the cause of and solution to all our problems. And I think that the same thing can be said of the law. It is both the cause of horrific violence and debasement and oppression and indignity. It is also the solution to all those things. And if you are, driving in Alabama when you're black, you know this, right? You know that the police are not on your side. And by the same token, if you are a woman right now in prison today in Alabama because you had a miscarriage that the state thinks was, self-induced, then you too are not being afforded dignity and respect and equality by the law. So every single person in the book is toggling wildly within that tension, right? And one of the things I loved was they all come down actually in very different places. And Sally Yates is like the high water mark of someone who genuinely, and folks will remember, she was the acting attorney general when Donald Trump signed the travel ban. She found out about it on her phone, the way I did. Nobody vetted it with the Justice Department. And she had to decide within 48 hours whether she was going to go into court and defend it. And she looked at it, and she looked at it with her staff, and she said, this violates both, due process rights and First Amendment religious freedoms. I will not defend it. And then as Masua just told you, given the choice to just quit or say, I'm not going to defend this, go ahead and fire me, there's no way I'm putting the imprimatur of the Justice Department, which I revere, on this executive order. And that's someone who has such confidence, is as you said, an insider, but has such confidence in legal institutions and structures that that's where she lands. The next chapter in the book is Becca Heller, who is a totally different animal. Becca is right out of law school. She founded IRAP, which is a refugee assistance project. She cops in the book to have illegally practicing law. One else, don't do what she did. She was totally unlawfully practicing law at Yale Law School until she was caught out for it. And she was the person, you may recall, who put up the Google Doc that said, these people are going to get on their airplanes, and they think that they have work permits, and they think they have visas to enter, and some of them have sold all their possessions in order to come to this country, and they're going to get off their airplanes with nothing and be told that they don't belong here, that those immigration documents are not valid. And so what I want is every lawyer in America, I don't care if you do tax or divorce or probate, go to an airport, hold up a sign that says, I'm a lawyer, and represent those people. Because even if you don't know what you're doing, you will be there for them as a lawyer. And you may also recall, and in the book I tear up when I write it, it's the only time in American history where people are standing outside the airport chanting, let the lawyers in, let the lawyer, right? For one flickering second, we are the heroes of the American story. And this is all down to one little kid who I showed up at the airport in ripped jeans and a hoodie, and my Jewish mother was appalled, right, that I was on TV looking like that. But Becca is so utterly unsentimental about the law. I think in the book she says straight out, the law is bullshit. It's not, I have no high regard. It's not magic or special. She quotes Audre Lorde, I'm using the master's tools to take down the master's house. That's it. So I love that some of the lawyers in this book are really, really committed both to being insiders, to protecting institutions, to saying, the thing that we must do is bolster institutions and make them more just, but they are inherently just. That's Sally Yates. And Becca Heller, who says the whole thing is skewed against us, always and forever, but as long as I have a license, which she now does, to practice law, I'm going to use it to make as much trouble as I can for institutions. And one beat on this that I think is very interesting that I didn't notice until after I wrote the book, some of the people who have the most lofty, aspirational view of the law are some of the women of color. Vanita Gupta, who is the head of the Leadership Conference of Civil Rights, a person who has no reason to think that the law is a great thing, is completely in the tank, both for the institution of the Justice Department and for law. Anita Hill, who you may have heard, has very little reason to have confidence in due process and legal systems. Absolutely in the book, I think, is the person who most emphatically says, without law, there's chaos. Without law, plan B is violence and power and money. And you know who's not going to thrive under that? Women and vulnerable minorities. So I thought it was really, really interesting that some of the people who actually have the most to lose, the most lived experience of seeing the law betray them, are the ones who double down again and again to say it is not perfect. It is working exactly as intended, which is to put down minorities and women and vulnerable groups at the expense of powerful, often male, moneyed interests, and still. It's the only game in town, and I'm here to fix it. It's really interesting that, in some sense, that arc was the arc for me of starting to write the book during Whole Women's Health, when women, had a high water mark in an abortion case at the Supreme Court in 2016. That's where the book begins. And I finished the book, and then Dobbs came down on June 26th of last year, and I had to rewrite huge chunks of the book in the 4 days before it shipped, and literally sitting there day and night rewriting the epilogue and the introduction. But that arc of how much do I continue to pour my beliefs and my confidence into the system that just turned on a dime, that went from lifting up women in Whole Women's Health to putting them, incarcerating them in Oklahoma after Dobbs. And where I land on that question is very much, I think, I often say the subtitle of this book could be Lady Justice, Welcome to Dahlia's Nervous Breakdown.
I think that I just realized for someone so my research is focused on law and social change and about strategies for social change. And I just realized, and I'm thinking a lot personally on after what you said, I'm hearing the situation in Israel right now and the legal reforms that are basically threatening Israeli democracy. And I'm thinking a lot about my colleagues and the people that I know that ask themselves right now, do I participate in some of the discussions for their legislation? Am I legitimizing the result that might not be democratic? Is it my duty to do that? And when I'm listening to you, this is the first time I realized why this book is so amazing, because it gives us a spectrum. It gives us a spectrum, and your answer, in a sense, is all of it. All of it. Yes, and all of it. Which I think is really inspiring, so thank you. This is on one of our conversations, Dahlia told me, I wrote a pink book about women. And this book is about women, but not just. And I want to ask you, what's the role of men in promoting justice for women?
So here's where you should just know that in the introduction I explain why I wrote a little pink book about the law, and it's largely because of very famous and important constitutional professor, law professor, who I shall not name ever, asked me once, when I told him the subject of my book, he was like, why do you want to squander all of the capital you've built in 20 years of covering the court on a little pink book about the law? And I was like, it's sort of funny, right? Because if Jeff Toobin had written a book about women in the legal resistance, it wouldn't be a little pink book about the law. So I wanted to very much sort of step into that. And there was a moment when the good people at Penguin Press, who have been a dream to work with, said, oh, it's really pink. Is there any way we could make it like, say, blue? Not a joke. And it was the only time where I just dug in and said, no, I think this actually has to be a pink book about the law. But at the same time, and this is important, and maybe we can talk about it for a minute, because it is very much a book that was written to kind of counter-program the cult of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Because I was very, very worried in the years that I was covering the court that we had somehow convinced ourselves that if you just buy the RBG tote bag and the RBG hat and the earrings and also the throw pillow, which I have, to be clear.
And by the way, the Christmas ornament.
Ah, nice.
I just saw this year, a Christmas ornament, RBG.
Justice Ginsburg would be very proud.
I'm sure.
But you know that we had substituted kind of fan consumerism for actually doing social justice work. And this was making me very, very nervous. And when Justice Ginsburg died, and I know someone's going to ask in the Q&A, so we can fight about it then, but there was, I think, the corollary to thinking that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is going to save us all, and all we need to do is buy the headband. The flip of that was, when she died and we were mad that she hadn't stepped down, RBG has single-handedly brought about the demise of democracy. And to me, both of those stories are stories about passivity, right? They're stories about, not my fault, this is all on her. And I think both those stories are a little bit the reason we are in the soup right now. And so I wanted to tell a very different story, with all due respect to the justice, which is the story of all of the people in the world who, but for this or that accident of history, would have been Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And the book very deliberately starts with Pauli Murray, who, if you haven't heard of, and I graduated from law school and never learned about Pauli Murray, one thing you need to do for homework is go home and watch the documentary, My Name is Pauli Murray, by Julie Cohen and Betsy West, which really, I think, sets forth the story of another person who, simply because Pauli Murray was gender nonconforming before there was language for that, because Pauli Murray was black, because Pauli Murray couldn't get into UNC, although grandparents on one side were slave owners, couldn't get into Harvard because presented as female, goes to Howard Law School, writes a paper that says essentially, hey, you know what would be cool? Let's use the 14th Amendment to end school desegregation. They laughed at her, first of all, in school, stuck it in a folder. Someone pulled it out, forgot to tell Pauli Murray that became the spine, the backbone of the petition in Brown v. Board of Education, argued by Thurgood Marshall successfully at the court. Nobody tells Pauli Murray, oops, we used your law school paper. Pauli Murray uses the same 14th Amendment theory to really write and do radical gender discrimination analysis. Nobody credits Pauli Murray until, thank goodness, RBG, when she is working at the ACLU Women's Rights Project, puts Pauli Murray's name on a brief, even though Pauli Murray doesn't work on the brief, as a way of saying, I stand on the shoulders of giants. So at every turn in history, Pauli Murray is refusing to move to the back of the bus long before Rosa Parks. Pauli Murray is desegregating lunch counters long before it's happening in South Carolina. And Pauli Murray is just not getting credit. Nobody knows who Pauli Murray is. And in fact, this is my favorite part of the story, pen pals with Eleanor Roosevelt, just completely ahead of their time in every single way. And my favorite part of the story is when Pauli Murray writes a letter to Richard Nixon that says, Dear President Nixon, I'm told you want the first woman Supreme Court justice. I have a good idea. Me! And Richard Nixon doesn't write back. But, Pauli Murray was prodigious is prodigious, and history has all but forgotten Pauli Murray, and my law school, I'm sad to say, never taught me about. I'm looking at my roommate. Did we learn about Pauli Murray in law school? We did not. So this is shocking, right? And this is, I think, part of the problem of living in a constitutional world where we just sit around thinking Robert Mueller's going to save us all. And then we think, now Jack Smith is going to save us all, and Merrick Garland is going to save us all. And to me, the lesson here is we all have to be the sort of Ruth Baby Ginsburgs that we want to see in the world. And the good news is we are. I mean, we are. And so that crosses gender, race, every kind of line. And to me, the people in this book are avatars. They are not, in case you're wondering, the 9 lawyers who are the most important lawyers of the Trump era. Each and every one of them is a stand-in for 100 others, and each and every one of them knows that they worked with a huge team of people who were doing the work along with them. And so what I wanted this book to do more than anything else is not just lift up, this handful of women. It's no good if you put down the book and go out and try to buy a Sally Yates mug. I will have failed utterly if there's a brisk uptick in Becca Heller t-shirts at the end of this book. What I really wanted is to say we are all this. Every one of us, particularly those of us who went to law school and have the ability to go to an airport and hold up a sign that says in Arabic or Pushtu, I am your lawyer, I am here to help. We can all do this every day. And so the role of men is important. The role of every other ally is important. But more than anything else, what I want people to read in this book is the role of you.
I think this is a great point with which to turn to you for some Q&A. Just let me please emphasize that in Q is question.
Thank you so much for being here. This is really exciting. I've listened to your podcast for years, so this is thrilling. I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the sort of 4-day interval from getting the Dobbs opinion and having to sort of reframe the book, and how I sort of already being in the mindset of this book is important after the death of RGB, but sort of was that reworking really, really difficult, or was it sort of just things are worse? Or if you could kind of just talk a little bit more about what you think really shifted based on that for the book.
So it's a great question, and I think the sort of flip answer is because after SB 8, which was the Texas vigilante bill, went into law in the beginning of October, in the beginning of October, already it was clear for those of us that were watching that Roe was in the crosshairs. Then, by the time Dobbs was argued at the Supreme Court, I think anyone who was watching felt that it was pretty clear what was coming. And if that wasn't, enough, Encyclopedia Brown here saw the leak, right? Once we all saw the leak of the Dobbs opinion, we knew. And so really by October of last year, I knew what was coming, and I suspect most of you did too. And I was already kind of bracing for it. I think that the 2 things that were a surprise for me on June 24th when Dobbs came down were, one, and this is a whole other question about the Supreme Court and legitimacy and all this stuff, but I was surprised that Justice Alito had made no changes. I had been on the news telling everyone that, he was fact-checked on history, he was fact-checked on medicine, the economists, fact-checked the heck out of that guy. I thought he would just change his opinion to at least align it with what we like to think of in the business as truth, but no. And that surprised me. And the other thing that surprised me is how shocked everyone was. That I think that there was this deep, deep national sense of what just happened, that for those of us who were watching the court was quite perplexing because we had seen it coming. But I think that really surfaced for me, and this is quite important. Anita Hill has maybe my favorite line in the book, where she describes in the years before Trump and during Trump. She describes talking to law students and having a student come up to her and say, you know, Professor Hill, I don't know why you act as though the sky is falling. The sky is not falling. And she says, a few days later, I realized we don't live under the same sky. And I just thought it was such a transcendently gorgeous construction of the problem, right? So for me, I think Dobbs showed me that we don't live under the same sky. And a lot of very, very smart law professors had been coming on the podcast, and I'm thinking of Professor Catherine Franke at Columbia, who said to me early and often, you know, if you are a black person, a pregnant person in Louisiana, Dobbs was never, that wasn't the difference, right? Roe was never protecting you. It was certainly after the Hyde Amendment. If you were, you know, a black person in Mississippi or Texas, you never really had a right, an unfettered right to an abortion per Roe or Casey, because you were always driving for 3 days. And so realizing for me that in a sense Dobbs was a leveler, that everybody got to look around and say, like, this is shocking for me. This is the furthest thing from shocking for half the country, where abortion access was never what Roe promised. And by the way, Roe was not a very good promise, right? Roe was a pretty sad high watermark for reproductive freedom. And so what I think I realized, and you know, Dorothy Roberts, Professor Dorothy Roberts was saying, you know, if they will come for your abortion rights, please know that contraception is next and IVF is next and policing black women's bodies is next, because by the way, that's been happening also, but we don't live under the same sky. And Michelle Goodwin was saying that. And so I really, Peggy Cooper Davis was saying it, so I really took that as an inflection point for me to think about the ways in which I wanted this book to be about living under the same sky. Understanding that the things that were shocking to a lot of Americans were life, were the water you swam in for a lot of others. And so partly that's why the last 3 chapters in the book are about voting and voting rights. It was really important for me to make this book about how do we fix the sky. And it's not winning lawsuits, right? It's fixing democracy. But partly because I needed the book then, and a lot of the rewriting was to acknowledge that the things that really shock us shouldn't shock us. They shock us because we're asleep. And I wanted this book in some sense, and that's why I think the epilogue reads the way it was, to be a sort of clarion call that if we keep sleepwalking, this is going to keep happening.
Thank you so much. You talked briefly about the failure of minorities to come together after Charlottesville, and I just am wondering, in your years covering the court, have you seen this done successfully, minorities coming together, and what makes that possible, and what can kind of the next generation of lawyers be doing to facilitate that?
I love that question. I mean, I think for me, the chapter about Vanita Gupta at the leadership conference was my attempt to answer that question, because Vanita very much is, and I put her exactly at the halfway point of the book in some sense, because I wanted to do that move from we're winning lawsuits, we're winning lawsuits, we're winning lawsuits, to oh my God, we're winning lawsuits and we're still losing. What next? And that enter Vanita, you know, stage left. And I think, and it also goes to Masua's really great question about insiders and outsiders, right? Because Vanita had spent her entire career suing the Justice Department until Eric Holder called her and said, come work for me at the Justice Department, right? And so she's very much someone who, again, is pinging back and forth between how we do social change. And I think that what I learned from her and what she was doing at the leadership conference, which by the way, you know, starts out as this unbelievable group of, you know, black train workers and Jewish, you know, Jewish activists. Like it really was, it has this amazing storied history of that kind of allyship. And what she has done there, I think, is exactly what you're describing. And folks, if you really want to see a model for, I think, who is doing the kind of allyship across communities and making sure, and it's hard work, and for all the reasons Masua said, it's very hard now, but I think they are organizing across silos, and it is top of mind always that we need everybody on board or we're not gonna go. And so I think for me that was a template, that chapter, for how she was doing that. And the book ends with Stacey Abrams, I think, doing exactly the same thing in Georgia, that we don't realize unless we really dig deep that the miracle of what Stacey Abrams has been doing for a really long time and will be doing for a long time is finding all of these siloed groups who don't fully understand that working together is better than kind of going at each other and losing, and convincing them across this immense bandwidth to all kind of pull in the same direction. So one last point on this, I think it's, again, not entirely an accident that one of the people who is my hero on this is the Reverend Dr. William Barber, who organized Moral Mondays in North Carolina, who is also sort of scaling these huge coalitions and helping bring along groups that, for lots of good reasons, kind of put their parochial interests first. And if you have ever gone to a rally with, Reverend Barber, he is so deeply mindful of that as the work. That's the work, is to get us to work together, even though it's just so much easier to go at each other. And so I actually think this is where I look at the Gen Zs and the millennials. This is the part where I just look soulfully at the law students. Because I actually think you're kind of coded for this in a way that probably my generation is not. I think that the ability to work across coalitions is something that comes really, really naturally to kids that are my 19 and 17-year-old sons' ways. They just think this way. So I think it's not just that we have great leadership, but I've been really struck, and I should say Sally Yates says this in the book, Vanita says this in the book, Anita Hill says in the book, thank God for the Youngs. Like the Youngs are leading us on this. And Vanita says, by the way, sometimes they drive me crazy because they're just, so but they're doing it and they know how to do it. This is in their bones. And I really do think that while I want to say to you, like, look at Reverend Barber, look at Vanita, look at the people in the book, and certainly Stacey Abrams, what I also want to say is look at your colleagues. Because I think a lot of what we saw, even organizing around the midterms, was really ground up organizing across coalitions by people that some of us thought you were all super busy on TikTok, and in fact you were kind of busy saving the world.
I have a question about voting, because it just seems to it comes down so much to people just doing the basic thing, which is voting. And we can say Trump was an effect of people not voting, or the Supreme Court, the way it is now, is because voting didn't happen enough. Can you talk to us about how you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of what I said before about how I thought I was writing a book about law, and then I ended up writing a book about voting. And one chapter is about vote suppression, and one chapter is about gerrymandering, because Justice Alito says in the Dobbs opinion, women are not without political power. If you don't like it, go out and vote. And this is the same Justice Alito who in Brnovich was ending Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, right? So the same entity that is telling us go solve this at the ballot box is the entity that's making access to the ballot box harder and harder. And whether it's through Citizens United, that is distorting the vote, or whether it's by blessing partisan gerrymandering, distorting the vote, or whether it's getting rid of first Section 5 and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the court, in some sense, that is telling us, like, go fix this at the ballot, is the court that's also locking the door, right? That's problematic, and it's one of the things we have to think about. And so I ended the book on these kind of big structural democracy reform questions, partly as a way of saying, as I think I've now said twice, you just can't count on winning. And, you know, we all love Law and Order. This entire country is like a shrine to Law and Order, right? That theme song could be our anthem. We love trials, but trials are not going to get us there. They're not going to get us there. What's going to get us there is massive structural democracy reform, and that is just the mind-numbing, eye-glazing work of fixing state gerrymandering, of doing what we can about fixing the Electoral College, doing what we can about a malapportioned Senate, right, where millions of people are not represented because Wyoming gets the same amount of senators as you, fixing the fact that 5 of the 6, you know, conservatives on the Supreme Court were seated by majority presidents who lost the popular vote and then ratified by a majority Senate, and then who turn around and reduce voting, right? So you've got a perfect circle of the constricting of actual majority rule, all done under the color of law. All of this is lawful. So what are we going to do when we think about saving democracy? And it can't just be, as you said, we'll show up and vote in the midterms, we'll show up and vote in presidential elections. This is, and this is again why I end with Stacey Abrams, because they are doing this work every day, day after day, organizing around this. And they are, I think, calling out this signal that if you sort of do this, you know, as a side hustle while you're, you know, watching your Netflix queue, we're in big trouble. This has to be, and we don't exercise this muscle because it's shocking. It's part of the not under the same sky, right? We keep saying democracy's working. Democracy held in 2020. Democracy held by like chewing gum and spit and a Band-Aid in 2020. And we've only just reformed the Electoral Count Act in December so that what, you know, almost happened in 2020 can't happen again. But the idea that we can just like let the system just keep purring along and that voting is going to sort of self-effectuate, I think has been the single greatest myth that's been put to rest in the last few years. And one of the reasons I'm super heartened by what happened in the midterms is that next to Dobbs and the economy, one of the things that people showed up for was democracy. I mean, people said top of mind when they went to vote was, you know, election denialism, was, you know, vigilante vote suppression. That stuff scared people. And I think that if we are kind of there, where we understand how fragile the vote is, and that we understand that like elections officials can't be afraid to go to work, and that we can't have the wife of a sitting Supreme Court justice like phoning around to people in Pennsylvania saying maybe set aside the election results. All of that stuff I think is pretty salient. And so what I think is we now understand, like we're not under the sky we thought we were under. Democracy is not self-effectuating and it's certainly not perfect, and the vote is the most vulnerable place, but it can all be hardened. And it's being hardened, by the way, by amazing groups, Mark Elias and Protect Democracy. There are groups doing this. So what we need to do is say, I'm not gonna like hit pause or snooze and think about this 2 weeks before the 2024 election. I think what we need to do is say, I'm gonna do an hour of Netflix and 2 hours of systematic democracy reform every day between now and then. And that is not hard, not easy. It is gonna take years, but it's really eminently doable. And I think that the muscle we're now flexing is only beginning to be flexed because I think a lot of us are just waking up to how perilous it is.
Well, I'd like your thoughts on the role, some would say place of women as wives. Ginny Thomas is the bad example of that, but it raises all the issues of the independence of the husband and the wife and their different careers and the influence on the Supreme Court and the privacy involved with the Supreme Court.
It's a really good question. The wife question, you know, for many years, this wasn't a problem because the wife stayed home, right? And really stayed home. Justice Brennan's wife, I think, was like locked in the top of a tower, combing her hair. I mean, they really prevented the spouses from having any kind of political life, and so the problem was solved. And this really did become a problem, even here in California, right, where you have Judge Reinhart on the Ninth Circuit, whose wife is, at the ACLU, and they're having to navigate that. So this is just a problem for the very best reasons, which is, thank goodness women get to work and have vibrant political lives. But you're right, because it creates a whole host of problems, most notably that all of the sort of conflicts of interest that used to attach to your son, right, that you can't take a case if your son has a vested interest, now attached to the wife. And the story that makes me a tiny bit crazy in the Clarence Thomas iteration is the idea that it's sexist to have a problem with what Ginny Thomas is doing. There's no part of me that wants Ginny Thomas to go back to, ironing shirts or whatever wives did before they got to have lives. But I think it's not sexist to say that if she is benefiting from her proximity to someone in so much power, right? She has access to all the clerks, she has access to this massive network. She was promising for years to her donors of her groups that she had access to the Donald Trump White House, because she did, because she could bring them into the White House. So it's not sexist to say if you have that kind of access, which she did, then you have to enforce recusal rules, because it is not sexist to say she is palpably benefiting from her access to him. So it's not sexism, but it's also not a new problem, because in every other Article 2 judge, we have ethics rules. This is not hard, right? We have, canons, and we have statutes that say that if you have somebody close to you, whether it's your son or your wife or your dad or your business partner, who has a vested interest in the outcome of a case, then you step down. And the problem isn't sexism. The problem is that ethics code does not apply to the US Supreme Court. There are 9 people in the world who say, it's so cute, Chief Justice says, we consult the ethics rules. So, I consult the weather. I may or may not abide by it, but I consult it. This is just not a plan. It's fixable. The court could have ethics rules by which they are bound. But I do think that one of the things that I want to say about, because I think under your question is this other question about legitimacy and the judges and the justices. And when people like me say that the justices are behaving poorly right now, I'm not saying it, believe it or not, because I didn't like the outcome in Dobbs. To be sure, I did not like the outcome in Dobbs. But I didn't say the justices were illegitimate after Shelby County, and I didn't say that the court was illegitimate after Citizens United. When the justices behave in illegitimate ways that make themselves look illegitimate, whether it's the shadow docket, right, deciding cases on an emergency basis in the dark of night, or flying to the Mitch McConnell Center to give a speech about judicial independence while sitting next to Mitch McConnell, or, as Justice Alito did, flying to Rome after Dobbs to say, Dobbs was pretty awesome, wasn't it? These are, in my view, low-hanging fruit. These are things that the justices could fix tomorrow. And the failure to meet the moment on their part, the failure to say maybe there's something about this 25 approval rating that has to do with our conduct, with Justice Thomas's failure to recuse, with justices who go to the Federalist Society convention while their clerks and court employees can't even have a bumper sticker. This is the problem. And so what breaks my heart is, believe it or not, and I know nobody believes it, I actually really need there to be a legitimate Supreme Court. For the same reason that Anita Hill needs there to be a legitimate Supreme Court. Because the alternative to the Supreme Court, I often say cynically, is the army, right? That's how you get what you get in totalitarian countries. So in order to have functioning constitutional democracy and the rule of law, you need a court that is legitimate. And so the critiques, believe it or not, don't come from people who just want to destabilize the court or pack the court or see security fencing around the court or death threats to the justices. That is anathema to those of us who love the court. But what we want is to see the justices do the very bare minimum, very knowable, achievable things that make them look legitimate in the eyes of the public. And the fact that for 2 years, they have not only not done that, but in my view, doubled down and doubled down again on the unethical behavior is what scares me more than anything else, because I worry deeply that the 2024 election is going to get decided by the Supreme Court. And with a 25% approval rating, that means it will be fought out on the streets. And that is literally the thing that the justices have said across all ideological lines. That's the thing that scares them the most, and yet they're the ones who are squandering it.
Thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. So I'm a young Jewish law student here, and I appreciate so much of your optimism about us young people and what we can do next. But I guess my question for you is, how do you reconcile that optimism with potentially this idea that anti-Semitism is both on the rise in the country and that there is maybe a particular breed of anti-Semitism that might exist within the progressive movement itself? I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I mean,
Sorry for that question.
No, I'm sorry to step on your very, very, very flimsy, ephemeral optimism, Dahlia. But I mean, I'm as scared as you are of all of it, and I'm scared of it. And Masua can speak to it probably better than I because you teach here. But I am scared of it from the left and from the right, and I'm scared about the similarities in some sense, because I do think it comes down to the same kinds of tropes and the same ideas about power and about puppet mastering that go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. I mean, I can't say that I have an easy fix for this. I think what I can say, and it's not going to mollify you, I don't think, but I will say watching that Charlottesville trial for me, watching that unspool over days and days, and watching a jury that did not know or care about anti-Semitism learn what it meant. And this is the tool I have, right? I mean, I'm not an organizer, I'm a lawyer. And when I saw that story told in the courts, and when I saw that jury hearing that story, it was not familiar, it was not comfortable. They didn't know what they didn't know about anti-Semitism. And yet they ruled the way they did. To me, it felt, and this goes to like the sort of obvious answer, which is we can all learn and we can all teach. And we are in a country and in a moment where we do not want to talk to each other across our silos. We would rather point and shoot. And so for me, I think my optimistic answer to your very worrisome question is at least my sense is that I have seen this turn. And I've seen it turn, and I say this as somebody who works at Hartman and thinks about this a lot from the perspective of education. But I think that we need to do the thing that is really, really hard in this country, which is listening and empathy and all the stuff that we have kind of forgotten how to do. But time and time and time again, I am struck, I don't know if you are going to disagree with me, by the ways in which, in any context that I see it, including that trial, if people can tell their stories and people can listen, there can be change. It's really hard to tell your story when everyone is screaming on both sides. I understand that. But there is, at least for me in the law, a lane and tools with which to do that I actually, if you had told me 3 years ago that Charlottesville trial could have ended with such empathy and solicitude for anti-Semitism in America at this moment, I would not have believed it. We can do this, it's hard, but I don't know that it's hopeless. I don't know if you have a...
I'm just thinking while you're talking about both of it can be done, and then the other piece is what our responsibility, each of us, as law school students, agents, as university professors, as agents for change, as university professors, as the university itself, as the law school itself. What is each of our responsibility to create the platform in which? So the problem is not with the story, but the problem is getting the story, right? Both telling and listening. So the responsibility for each of us. And then I think it, again, goes back to what you said before about coalition buildings and who to cooperate with. And we have allies.
Can I say one last thing that I said this morning, it's my new Torah. I was in conversation with Rabbi Sharon Brous the other day in LA at ICAR, and like, wow, she's so smart. And one of the things that we talked about is that I hate one story that's told of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And the story I hate is the one in which she kind of craftily and through cunning and tactics started bringing suits on behalf of the ACLU Women's Rights Project, bringing suits on behalf of men, male plaintiffs, because these judges, who are unerringly men, would better empathize, right, with a male plaintiff. And so she very trickily found the male plaintiff who couldn't take care of his son when the spouse died and couldn't get benefits, who couldn't take care of his ailing mother and couldn't get benefits, whose wife was in the military and couldn't get benefits, all of which was gender discrimination based on gender stereotypes about who worked and who stayed home, right? And the story we all tell, and the one that I love to tell because it makes her seem really smart and evil, is like this was a trick. Like this is a party trick, right? She finds these male plaintiffs and she wins, and then women get freedom, but like she kind of hoodwinked the judges into thinking that they were helping men, but really they're helping women. But of course that's not true. Like if you ask Justice Ginsburg what she was fighting for, and I love this so much that she was fighting for it, like back in the days when my dad wouldn't change a diaper. But what she was, and I love my dad, but like what she was fighting for was the idea that men really could stay home with their children and really could take time off from work and get benefits and take care of their ailing mom. That it would be a better world for men if men could have the sort of fully realized, nurturing, complicated daily life that women had. And that's what she was fighting for. And I think, by the way, it's the thing she most regrets, that we made a lot of movement on getting women into the workplace and maybe a little less movement in having a generation of men who could be, you know, completely equal to women in all the ways that mattered to her. And the reason I sort of say this is Torah for me is because it's such a beautiful model of how to make the world better. That instead of having this story of scarcity, right, that there's only a few jobs, and if women get them, then men are like pushed down, or that there's only a few, you know, spots at Harvard and UNC, and if people of color get them, then I am pushed down. I actually think the RBG model, if we really could figure out a way to talk and think about it, is a curative to this scarcity myth, you know, that if you get stuff, I don't get stuff, and if you win, I lose, and if you have dignity, then I have no dignity, and if you have rights, then I'm small. I just don't think that's how she wanted the world to be. I love that I started by saying I don't do RBG hagiography, and I'm just like a short hop from a sonnet right now. But I do really think that one of the ways I want to think about doing social justice going forward is from that place of, it's not a trick what Justice Ginsburg was trying to do. It was kind of beautiful. And I think if we can start to do a better job of telling the story of social justice, that is that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that if you do well, I do well, and if you can have a fully realized amazing life, because believe it or not, most of the scarcity stories we tell around the law are garbage, then I really think that's kind of the template for where I want us to go in talking to each other. And maybe it's like I'm just high on my own supply here, but I really do think that that is a story we've almost completely failed to tell as a legal story and as a rights story and as a dignity story. And I think if we all start to think from that place of, you know, I'm unerringly pushing you down so I can go up, and instead tell what I think is like a really beautiful story that Justice Ginsburg would say about a world full of men who could change diapers. I think that's where I want to point my boat to right now, because I think otherwise I would be hopeless.
I have the most amazing deal to suggest to you after this talk right now. buy a book, get an RBG Christmas ornament.
Nice.
In a deal. I think that we might have missed like the right time for it.
Next year.
Next Hanukkah, maybe. But I think this conversation, I'm always so, this is every time that we talk, I am struck by the fact how you are such a model for, you were concerned and raised challenges, but I'm not depressed. And you were optimistic, but I'm not like in the skies where it is unachievable. And I think this was really a model for a nuanced conversation that really looks to reality in the eyes, but say, I can manage and I can pull it off. And each and every one of us not only can, but has the responsibility to do it. So thank you so much for coming to talk with us today. And thank you everyone for being with us. And good night.